Hello and welcome to the Kinda Fruity podcast. I'm Misfit and this is...
Hi, I'm Brenna. I'm his wife. I'm here.
Yeah, as you might have noticed from the intro, we finally have a name now. Ain't that great?
I mean, I guess. Don't know what you want me to say about that.
I figured, what the hell, we're both kinda fruity anyway, so it works out.
Are we?
Kinda?
I mean, some would probably consider us not, or at least one of us.
Well, I mean, we are in a more or less hetero-presenting relationship, so at first glance, maybe not, but we both have our individual little things.
And what things are those?
Well, like for myself, I'm demi-romantic pansexual, and for you as well, you're, what was it again? Bigender asexual? Or, no, bigender demisexual.
Yeah.
Hey, guess what? We're doing what we talked about in episode 2. We're talking about some labels. But before we get into that, there's been a few things that have happened since the last time we recorded. Notably, another little bit on the AI art thing. There's been a few different websites that have actively been banning AI-generated art, which is, like, understandable when it's something that's for a medium that's specifically for the created arts done by people, as opposed to, like, the generated results of a computer algorithm. But there have been a few images that have been generated that are kind of funny, and if you're catching this on YouTube, you'll probably be seeing a couple of those right now.
I'm not editing this, so you can blame that all on him.
I'm totally gonna throw up a picture of that, the girl eating ramen, and it's just sort of melting into her fingers, and there's like a fucking tongue in her forehead. Which, also worth note, while this podcast is generally sort of PG-13, there may be occasional coarse language. Just a heads up. Figure we'd throw that one out there.
Occasional?
It's me. It's all me.
Don't give yourself too much credit there, bud.
Besides all that, you've probably heard of the Stop Oil protests that have been going on lately. People throwing soup at paintings in different art galleries, and somehow that's supposed to get out the message to get off of oil. Now, while I would love to do a whole cast on that one today, we're actually going to be recording that one as its entirely own episode, because it's definitely deserving of its own topic, or at least I think so.
Yes, how do oil paintings, which are made of an entirely different substance, equal get off oil, which is also an entirely different substance?
Because we all know...
Hmm?
We all know Vincent van Gogh, 300 years ago, personally created the whole process of fracking by removing his ear, shoving it into the ground, and suddenly oil came up.
Yeah, because, you know, the type of oil that oil tycoons and oil businesses use is totally conducive to colors, paints, and artistic mediums whatsoever.
I mean, it covers the black color very well, that's about it.
Yeah, I don't think you can actually add color to oil. If you can, it'll surprise me. But considering most oil paints are... okay. Yes, I am currently looking that up at the moment because it's been a while since I've been in an art class.
Ooh, live fact-checking.
Okay, oil paints are typically slow-drying paints made from a colored pigments and oil, as the name suggests. Most commonly, linseed oil is used in most oil paints manufactured by different brands. So, how about we look up what linseed oil is real quick? Linseed oil, also known as flaxseed oil or flax oil in its edible form, is a colorless to yellowish oil obtained from the dried, ripened seeds of the flax plant. It is plant-based, like most paints generally are. Because even back in the old early days, paints were made of pigmentation by crushing flowers of varying colors.
Mm-hmm. Plus, linseed oil can just sort of be, like, cooked down to make it thicken up and make a good sort of sticky medium to put pigments in, so that's pretty much how oil paints were made in the first place, because they would just sort of stick, dry out, and they'd be, like, more or less permanently safe because, like, water and oil don't mix, so if your painting got rained on, it wouldn't get immediately ruined, generally.
Where the other type of oil, I'm pretty sure, is made out of mineral?
Yeah, basically...
I'll fact check that later.
Yeah, old ground up dinosaurs and shit. But, yeah. Other than that, there's one other little thing to talk about real quick. Since it's about 2 weeks out from now,
Excuse me if you hear me sipping from my addiction. Which isn't bad, it's literally just a particular brand of grape juice that I've become particularly fond of. I actually do not drink, surprisingly, considering I'm a furry, and, you know, we know about all those stereotypes of between furries and being adult in this age.
So, the little tangent I wanted to go off on real quick is, in about 2 weeks' time is, time for the, midterm election. I'm not going to go on a big tirade about voting or anything. I personally believe that it kind of doesn't matter all that much. Realistically, the two parties that are in power in the United States only really care about keeping their jobs. They don't really care about keeping anything particularly good or better. In fact, if shit gets worse, that tends to drive people to go to the polls more. But I'm still going to be going out and voting, and that's coming up on November 8th. So, yeah, this is my one call for everyone. If you can vote and you want to vote, like, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for. I do have my preferences. Unfortunately, none of them are currently running. Myself, I will be voting. And if you know much about me, or if you picked up on any of the stuff that I said in the last podcast, it would probably be pretty obvious where my votes are going, even though I'd prefer them to go elsewhere.
And speaking of that, I'm about to say something incredibly controversial, but this is kind of fruity, and we're not here to make a point. This podcast is not to quote or pit one opinion over another's opinion. Heck, we're not even going to call this a safe space for speech, technically. It is literally just two people or more, if we have guests, discussing random things, and therefore sometimes we might say something very controversial that the listener may not agree with, but guess what? That's okay. I'm going to say this now. I respect your decision to not like something I say or something he says, but I'm going to say it for myself personally. I respect your opinion and your decision that you probably will not like what's about to come out of my mouth. But speaking of voting, I personally do not. There's my controversial take. I will be nice enough and go ahead and probably be nice enough to explain why, even if my reasoning doesn't meet a standard or expectation. It isn't that I am unable to vote so much as short past bit. I have family of varying political views, and I have seen firsthand how gathering and speaking of politics is usually a high taboo, because there are some in my family that are not respectful of the views of other members of the family, to the point to where they will state their opinion knowing they are in the household of someone who votes the opposite direction and won't care and expect them not to say anything, which they don't, because guess what? They respect the fact that that other individual has a different opinion and political viewpoint. I have seen a lot of arguments in my family of, well, because we're married, you should tell me exactly what you're voting for, when no. I don't care if you are married. Your political viewpoint, if you go to vote, it should not be something you say to your spouse who you're voting for, because if you don't feel comfortable doing so, you shouldn't feel made to do so. So that's my take on that. So basically my reasoning is because seeing all of that and seeing how, in my personal opinion, it's, to me, my view of it is the political parties are literally just kind of like a beauty pageant for liars who can make and say the most and the biggest bullshit that they can pull over everybody else's eyes. No offense. I'm not saying anyone is being convinced or anything. I just don't want to put my hand in that pot personally. Honestly, if we get actual honest people, and you can tell, you know that these people are being 100% with you, and their political address is literally 100% making feasible promises that they can and will actually go through with, and are actually for the betterment of the entirety of people and not just a group or clique of people, but everybody, which I know you can't make everybody happy, but you get what I mean. Then yeah, I might consider voting if I can find an honest politician. Find me an honest politician and I may vote. You're welcome.
Yeah. And that's to say, like, in general, while she does tend to avoid politics like the plague, there's a lot of the stuff that I believe in that she's pretty well behind. Like, even if you don't see her running out to vote or campaign or anything like that, we're both pretty left of center. Like, definitely socialist, definitely a little bit Marxist, and all that fun stuff. And now that we've rattled off a bunch of labels, let's get talking on that.
Yeah, by the way, I don't know what any of those things he just said means. I actually don't know what leftist means. That's how little on politics I go into. I'm sorry. I'll look it up later, I promise, or I have somebody explain it to me, but I literally don't know what that means. What it means to be leftist or socialist. I have no clue.
I mean, if they'd be up for it, maybe I could see about getting a guest on here to talk about that.
Sure.
So
explain it to me.
So, that being said, while this isn't exactly a quote-unquote safe space of ideas or anything like that, basically, we're not going to shy away from talking about controversial things, if anything like that comes up, and is interesting, and not just some sort of baseless, bad faith bullshit. But speaking on labels, let's dive right into how some of those are kind of an interesting topic. We were originally talking about, with the first episode, I was constantly referring to myself as a millennial, which, yes, technically I am a millennial. I was born between 1981 and 1995. AKA anyone who was born in there is a millennial.
Wait, that's what that means?
Yeah. So,
okay, another news flash. I actually do not know what a lot of these terms mean, only because they seem to keep migrating, evolving, and changing to the point to where I just lost track of, like, what is essentially a millennial, what is essentially, like, a boomer or anything like that. I actually do not know, because every time I've asked somebody, it's always a different answer, so...
So, millennials used to be known as Generation Y back when we were growing up, and that used to be kind of a fundamental thing that became a bit of a joke, that we were always asking why, and that's why we were Gen Y.
I mean, I was literally about to say that makes sense, because I know for a fact that anytime I got in an argument with a parental unit, I was always going, well, why do I have to do this?
Mm-hmm.
So, I can see that. I can see the generation, why?
So, a quick one on some of the generations. Most of us who are born in the US or even up in Canada, this is a very Amerocentric thing, where it's, in terms of separating out our generations, this is how we describe them. The biggest well-known one would be the baby boomers. So, in 46 to 1964 is where you have the boomers. Basically, as soon as people started coming home from World War II, what's the number one way to celebrate, right? Have more kids. A lot of the boomers would end up fighting in the Vietnam War, or being part of the counterculture of the 60s, like just the hippies and the anti-war protests.
Okay. I had a feeling that it had something to do with the baby boomer. saying,
Mhm.
but I wasn't sure if those were actually correlating.
Yeah, they got their generational name from the literal baby boom of the 50s and 60s. Like my dad, he was born in 1951, and he ended up fighting in Vietnam. That's one thing that's also kind of interesting about a lot of these generations is there's sort of a little bit of a almost revolutionary energy that you find about a certain age, because like the boomers tended to rebel against the stuff that the previous generation would go against, and then the followers, Generation X, basically the kids of boomers and also of older ones of the silent generation. The silent generation was basically between 28 and 45, so people that were born around the time of the Great Depression, Korean War, and stuff like that.
Which would entail, like, my grandfather, I
Yeah.
believe. That is weird. Why was it called the Silent Generation?
I'm not too sure. There's not a lot of information on it because, yeah, there was a lot of stuff that happened back then, like the Depression, the Dust Bowl, the Korea War, all of that stuff where everything just sort of started to crumble for a little while.
You know, that might actually make sense now that I think about it, it being called silent, because, like, knowing how my grandfather is, he does tend to quietly take things.
Mm-hmm.
And he's always had this he is what you consider an old military man. Like, he does still have that. He has a very booming loud voice, things like that. But I could be wrong, but I do know, like, when it comes to both the Vietnam and Korean War, when the soldiers come back, weren't they sort of treated with a poor to non-existent reception?
Pretty much, yeah. By both their people of the same generation, because it was sort of a hard split between either those that supported the war or those that fought against it. And like a lot of that revolutionary energy that I had alluded to was also beyond just the war, but also around the civil rights movement of the time.
So yeah, that would explain it, because it feels like, personally, I think that might be where the name probably would come from, is the fact that everyone that came back from the silent generation were people who tended to, especially nowadays, that they're much older in their older age especially, they're more prone to just being silent about a lot of things.
Yeah, there's just sort of this almost austerity in a sense of the generation, that they sort of kept a lot of their problems, they kept them to themselves and didn't really like actively seek to change anything, or at least that's the perception. That's another thing that we'll get into too. After the boomers came Gen X. So anyone born between 65 to 1980. Some of the biggest stuff that was around Gen X's time would be the Cold War. So a lot of Gen X grew up with that sort of innate fear that at any moment their world could end in like nuclear hellfire, and that would also end up sort of tempering some of that revolutionary energy a little bit. But in Gen X, you would also see a lot more rise towards a little bit more fringe thinking. Stuff that came out of Gen X would be a lot of the hip-hop, early rap, as well as the grunge and punk movements.
So, out of curiosity, would my dad and uncle and them be Gen X then?
They'd probably be Gen X, yeah.
Because, speaking on that, my uncle was born, I believe, sometime in the 60s, and my dad was born, I want to say early 70s, so it was like late 60s for my uncle, early 70s for my dad.
Yeah, that would sound right. Now, one thing that characterizes a lot of these generations is there's about like a 15 to like 25 year gap between them, usually in the sense that of course, most people wouldn't start having kids until, like, at the youngest, maybe 15 to 16 on the fringe cases, or by and large, by up to 25, a lot of people would have already had kids. So,
Yeah.
Usually, that's where they start putting the cutoffs of generations.
Okay. I mean, it also seems to me that, like, between the different generations, I'm pretty sure between the Depression era, like, and like the X era, there seems to have been a decline of having like too many kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because like for my family, for example, like my grandfather's had like 7 or 8 siblings. My grandmother's had 7 or 8 siblings, but between my grandparents, they had 3 kids.
Yeah, that's also one thing that happens a lot with Gen X. That happened was not as many of them had like as large a families as their parents did. For my dad, I think he had like 5 or 6 direct siblings. There's only like one of them, aside from him, that's even alive today. Most of them died for various circumstances. But for any of their kids, that would have been like Gen X for some of them. There weren't too many of those either.
Well, I do know that there is some outliers of that theory too, considering personally, I'm sorry if I'm getting really personal, but my family is like the only means for me to like catalog this stuff in my brain, so I apologize. But my mom was definitely an outlier because she has I think 6 siblings. I would have to literally name them on my fingers. Give me a sec. 5. She had 5 brothers.
Okay.
I had to count. I had to name them on my fingers for a second. I know there was at least. I know there was. There was. I know the number 6 was there, but I couldn't remember if that was 6 siblings or 6 in total. So it's 6 in total. My grandparents on her side had 6 kids in total. But my mom had 5 brothers, so there's an outlier there a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Not too differently. Only one uncle remains. I only have one uncle remaining.
Yeah, for
but
me,
continue.
I also have like a half brother who was born like I believe he's technically Gen X, or maybe he's also a millennial. That's another thing too, like a lot of these dates have shifted over the years. Previously, like millennials or Gen Y used to be anyone born after the 90s. But then it shifted to be like the 80s instead was the starting point. Millennials or Gen Y was anyone who was born from 81 to 96. So like the kids of the older Gen X or baby boomers. Myself, my dad was like 39 when we were born. My mom was 19. So kind of a bit of a difference there. But like for us both, defining characteristics of our generation, we grew up long enough to see the world as it was for a little while, and then see how everybody lost their absolute minds when stuff like 9/11 happened, or the
oh good lord,
the supposed Y2K crisis. We grew up around like the sort of increase in technology and just sort of general technical sort of proficiency and awareness.
Y2K was a trip and a half.
Uh-huh.
Like, I remember going to stores, like, it didn't matter what store you went to. Any store, especially if they had, like, a plushie section or had some kind of, like, sponsored material, they had the Y2K bug plushies all over the place that you could buy, along with, like, random people literally swearing up and down that we were going to have, like, some kind of electronical apocalypse because there's going to be a virus among viruses, and that once the year 2000 hit, all of our technology was just going to shut off.
Yeah. The reality of it was that there wasn't a lot of future-proofing in technology because all the stuff was super new. So a lot of the older computers that were still propping up everything weren't really designed to account for the fact that the year 2000 was a thing. So it would have essentially caused their computer dates to roll back to like the equivalent of 1900, which I guess would have messed up banking or something. So a lot of companies had to spend millions, if not billions in some cases, about upgrading their computers to account for a 4-digit date instead of just 2 digits.
It was It was very dumb.
Yeah, it's one of those things that it could have been kind of an issue, but was, like, the possibility that it would have even become as much of a problem as people expected is not really out there. But then again, I'm not a computer guy. I just use them.
Which, it was still funny. Like, that's supposed to have been like a crisis era, and it's still funny to me to this day. If anybody else remembers the Y2K bug plushies that they were selling during that time, you know, it was like, this is supposed to be a scary crisis thing, yet there's a cute little bug plushie being created and sponsored and sent all over the place for people to have. As a memento that they survived, I guess? I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of those things where it clearly started out that there was, like, an issue that people were aware of, but at the same time, it's also just as much that it was a marketing gimmick. Like, sure, there would have been a problem, but then people realized they could make some money off of this thing.
You know, I just realized, and this is something that you'll find very hilarious, hon. If Y2K had tried to happen in this memeable era, it would literally be the, oh no, please don't turn me into a marketable plushie. Y2K today. Please don't turn me into a marketable plushie. Ah, damn it.
Then right next to it, you'd have that fucking stonks meme posted. Big line go brr.
Yeah, you know, when you think about it that way, thinking about it that way, to be perfectly honest, that makes that meme a little bit more relatable. Because it's not just a today thing, it's like way back when things that shouldn't have been made into marketable plushies were made into marketable plushies.
So like with millennials, there was sort of this kind of perception from a lot of the older generations that millennials were just lazy and didn't want to do anything, which really was like, a lot of them were kind of, I guess, getting red-pilled from an early age of, hey, the system is kind of rigged. Especially when it came to anything with trying to find a job, where you would find a lot of places requiring like multiple years of experience for something as simple as manning a cash register, when that kind of used to be an entry-level job. And it's like, okay, how am I supposed to get work experience if I can't get a job? And that also became kind of a thing too, because for a lot of us when we were growing up around the late aughts, when we started graduating from high school and looking for work, was when the Great Recession happened, when a lot of places just weren't hiring because they couldn't really afford to employ a bunch of people, or they just didn't want to take that kind of risk. So a lot of people in our generation started working at a much later age.
Oh yeah. Also, yes, I have indeed found it. I not only found it, I found the vintage 1997 Y2K bug plush. I remembered there was blue, so as soon as I saw the blue, I was like, yes, that's the one I remember seeing in stores.
I had the green and black one.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I just remember the blue one. I remember the blue one.
That shit was dope.
I know. They did come out with other ones later, apparently, but this one was the more simplistic and early design. Apparently you can still probably find them on Amazon. Because then they turned the thing, like, I think it was like after the year 2000 finally hit, they came out with this gross version of the toy.
Yeah, it was kind of like a weird spider-looking thing, if I remember correctly.
No, they came out, there was two versions. There was one from Hallmark, and then there was another one that was made that was called Squash or Crash the Y2K Bug doll. I can't remember who made it, but it was both equally ugly. They were both equally ugly compared to the early 1997 one. Sorry to sidetrack the conversation, but I literally found these pictures and I had to share them. You'll probably see them being like floating somewhere.
Oh yeah, that's the good stuff. Yeah.
But yeah, I would preferred, but the original one, because I remember seeing that one in stores.
Yeah. So, in addition to us, right after that would be Generation Z. So while we grew up around the starting point of where technology was starting to really take off, especially the rise of the information and internet age, we grew up around the start of social media becoming a thing. We saw stuff like MySpace, Facebook, and all those kind of take off and become a thing before, our 18th birthdays and stuff. For Generation Z, aka Zoomers, they were born from anywhere from 1997 to 2012, which is kind of a super short gap.
So my younger sister.
Yeah. They'd grown up specifically around that time. Some of them are young enough to have remembered 9/11 happening, but not really old enough to have been particularly aware of it. Because when it did, most of them would have been like the earliest,
1 or 2.
3 or 4, yeah. At the latest.
I think, okay, I have to actually do some math real quick, just to give me a sec. I mean, it's a good thing. My sister is literally 8 years younger than me, so, see, I was born in 1989, so add 8 years to that.
So that'd be 97 exactly.
Yeah. I thought so, because my dad had this thing, alright? I had this little desk that he made. He liked to do to work with wood. He liked to do woodworking on occasion. So he made this little desk for me because I was like this little artist kid, And so because of that, he painted it. And he repainted it when my little sister was born. Even though it was my desk still, it was repainted because originally it just had like my birth year on it. It was repainted to have my birth year on one side and my little sister's birth year on the other side, because even though, like I said, the desk was made for me, my dad had this weird thing of, to him, that was it was like the traditional height chart for kids. Like some parents did like a little height chart on the wall. For my dad, we had a height chart, but that was my sister's mother's doing. My dad wasn't one for that, but that little desk and making desks and things like that for us, that was essentially his height chart, but it was more like his this is the thing that I can do to show you guys that I am in your life. I make the desk and paint it for you. It is my sister's desk now, by the way. I did give that to her because my dad decided to make a new one for me using my art and some wood burning tools to carve. Using my art, he made a stencil out of an old wolf caricature that I drew, and he stenciled it onto the side of the wood. And because I was an artist, he made the desk backwards. Okay. It's the best way to explain it. He made the desk backwards, and it was literally put into an alcove that he cut out of my closet, because my closet had like extra space that I didn't use. So he literally cut that extra spot out and made the desk, the top of the desk, to like be a floating desk, sort of in between walls. So it was like an in the wall desk. So it was out of my way, but usable. And it was put in backwards to where when you open the desk, the lid acted like an easel to draw on, because he also put those hinges in there that you could lock so it could stay up. So when I wanted to draw, I just had to pull that up, lock it in place, put my paper on there, and just draw on it as like that. So it was specifically made and tailored for me. So there's a little personal bit. Anyway, back to labels.
Yeah, the thing about Gen Z, Zoomers, or Gen Z, if you're anywhere but the US, Basically, that they grew up a lot more ingrained with technology than we did. Like, by the time most of them were born or coming of age, the technology that we take for granted now was pretty much already there. And there's plenty of sort of discrimination against Gen Z, specifically for supposedly lower attention spans or just sort of obsessed with instant gratification as opposed to actually sitting down and looking at stuff. But the same could be said about literally any generation. Like, especially when you're younger, you've got that kind of energy where you just want to get up and do something. So I don't think that's particularly relevant.
Dude. When I'm not sure about that, but when I was younger, when I was a child,
a little kid,
a little babo, tiny thing,
small bean.
Yeah, small bean. I definitely had mixed attention span because I remember sitting down and watching something like the Disney's Prince and the Pauper with Mickey Mouse and thinking it was such a much longer movie than it actually was, to the point to where when I sat down and rewatched it to show what you called a Gen Z or a Zoomer person, when I was, because they had never heard or seen this Disney thing, I was like, oh, I gotta show it to you. And they were just like, dude, this is so short. And I was just like, wait, what? So I rewatch it, I look at it, and I'm like, oh my god, this thing was only like 20 to 30 minutes at most. Why did I think it was like an actual movie when I was a kid? What the hell? I remember it taking a while to get to the end. Like, your perception of time as a child is very different. So, like, I do not see that exactly in some of the Gen Zers or Zoomers or Zeds as you mentioned, because quite a few of them that I have known, they sit through movies that I cannot. Like, they have sat through the whole of the Titanic. Me, I can't even finish the first tape. When the first tape was done, I was like, okay, I'm done. And I was a teenager when I tried to watch that. My mother tried to make me watch that with her, and she was like, but there's another tape. I literally looked at her and said, not for me, there's not. There's only one. And I walked out of the room. And even to this day, I cannot sit down and watch the Titanic, but I can watch the entirety of the 10th Kingdom miniseries movie. I can watch that. So when it comes to like that whole attention span, I think honestly, it even back then as a kid, it really depends on like what you are being subjected to, on whether you have that attention span or not. So wholly stating that just because someone is a Gen Z, then that automatically means they are lacking in attention. I don't wholly agree with, only because I've known quite a few that could sit down and watch things that I could not.
Yeah, and myself, I'm like super scatterbrained most of the time, to where I'll usually be working on a couple of different things at the same time, all the while watching a YouTube video, just so I had some sort of a distraction, because I found it a lot easier for me if I disengage my mind with something else. I can easily focus on something, as weird as that may sound. Like, even if I'm at work, I've usually got like a Bluetooth in, listening to either a podcast or some kind of music while I'm stocking shelves, because like, well, one, stocking shelves is boring. Nobody likes doing it. It's just got to get done. But it's a lot easier to do it right if I'm distracting my mind with something else, instead of thinking about, man, this shit sucks.
I will say, though, when it comes to like the younger, or the generation that's younger than me and you, and even to some of the generations that came before us, and even our own generation, I will say this goes to all generations, there's one thing that I have noticed that is a common equal factor that a lot of people, no matter what generation you are in, have a very dangerous lack in ability for. And that is deductive reasoning.
Yeah. That's sort of one thing that's a little bit of a symptom of the internet and just sort of instant gratification culture, is that not a lot of people are willing to do any sort of like major fact checking and will easily take the first source they see as gospel on something, just leading to like really knee-jerk reactions on a lot of stuff, which is also part of why we didn't do the like the oil protest thing as an episode immediately, because up at the time that we were planning this was still pretty fresh. And even though there's a lot of new stuff going on now, there's still a lot more time that other info has come out about it, which we'll cover all that in the next episode after it.
I mean, considering like there's more come out about it, I'm pretty sure there's probably going to be more in general. Like, I feel like it's not gonna go away real fast.
Oh yeah, no. Now, for the last one of the generations, we come to the most current one. Generally, anyone born in the late 2010s and afterwards is called Generation Alpha. They're not typically the kids of Gen Z, because a lot of them are still kind of on the younger end. And lately, there have been trends that a lot of the younger generations are having children much later in life. Because, well, with the way the American economy has been over the last few years, and especially with inflation rising, a lot of people have come to the realization that they just can't afford to have a family.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit of private information, I suppose, but and that's kind of the reason why me and you haven't had any children yet, is, like, personally, which, to any viewer, Misfit, my husband, already knows this, we've discussed this multiple times, but I will say this is, yes, I do want to have children at some point, but currently, I'm sorry, but financially, spatially, mentally, and emotionally, we're not fit to be parents. And personally, I would feel, considering how I grew up, considering how my dad grew up, considering how my grandfather grew up, all of the stories that I had been told about how hard it was, how this or that, all of the essentially the different forms of depression era that seems to constantly coincide with having children. Because yeah, while we did have the Great Depression, there has been many or smaller depression eras that have happened throughout history. And my grandparents, my dad, and even myself seem to have been born into those smaller areas, to where, while yes, I had more than my dad had more than my grandfather, and so on and so forth, we were still born in more of the low-class areas. Like, we weren't rich. We had enough money for some things, but not enough for others, that kind of deal. Like, everyone knows that story, I'm pretty sure. Everybody else has probably lived something similar, so this is probably no news to anybody. But I would feel irresponsible as a human being to have a child in this current moment. Because there is a lot of different factors, a lot of different things. But the main thing is the fact, like you said, the economy right now, the essentially the entire development and the current state of the US especially doesn't feel conducive to a happy, healthy child rearing.
Yeah.
At least for now.
Yeah. So with that, for the next generation, Gen Alpha, that's anyone that's born like the late 2010s. So some saying as early as 2012, some saying around 2015. But generally the oldest Gen Alpha would be about 7 years old right now. big things that have happened in their life. They're probably not old enough to be aware of the impact, like socially or economically, that everything around the Trump presidency has had, or the effect of COVID-19, even though that was a truly fundamental part of their lifetime. So there's a lot of worry about how that's going to affect them growing up, just having the sort of trauma of how everything went down with that. Like in our generation, and even Gen Z also had we had the supposed bird flu pandemic, the whole Ebola scare, and a few other small ones here and there that all amounted to basically nothing. Whereas in this case, this was an actual legit pandemic that kind of literally shut down multiple countries across the world for months at a time.
Oh yeah, and border crossing is hella tight.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's affected a lot of people, like even people who want to go on honeymoons or trips. I don't know if it's still as bad, but I know certain areas, at least at some point during the pandemic, they made you stay in a off-beaten hotel on the outskirts, I think, to quarantine you, so that to make sure you're not going to bring anything into their country. Sometimes I think the stay was like a couple of days to a week. So when people were planning to go places, they had to account for that extra amount of time. Or in our case, when we flew to visit my family for a week, there's also the worry of, people who don't want to wear their masks. Like, there was a guy on our plane who the steward came by like several times and told him he had to put his mask on, and he kept taking it off as soon as she walked away.
Mm-hmm. And that was in 21, so just the year after the pandemic had happened, where it was still in the process of winding down. Like, as it is now, it's still a constant worry, but with vaccinations and like proper distancing, masking, and all the necessary precautions, it's been curtailed, but there's a lot of
going on.
Yeah, it's still out there. It's still something to be concerned about.
Like, we've got a friend right now who just caught it because of people literally laughing off the oh, you can't get it when you're outside, and even though they were wearing protection, the protection doesn't really work for a person. Okay, that's the one thing. The mask does not work for you personally. It's meant to keep you from giving it to somebody else.
Yep.
And if someone outside of you is not wearing that protection, they're dooming you, because the masks, yes, they're supposed to filter things. But it's like it's no different from the reason why doctors wear those masks. It's more for the patient than the doctor. Mm-hmm. Because there are like mesh. It's a mesh filter. It's because you're supposed to be able to breathe. And if I'm not mistaken, this virus can be passed airily.
More or less. Like, if it's through coughing or sneezing, the mask is going to block that from going out for the most part. Whereas if you're wearing a mask and the person you're speaking to isn't, if they cough or sneeze in your direction, you've still got two big ol' open eye holes that could easily catch that and just be a good vector for infection. But yeah, that's a small thing to be concerned about. So yeah, that is one thing that I really hate to say this like this, but I've said it before. The one thing I liked about the pandemic is that people started respecting personal space. Like, holy shit, if I don't know you, don't come up and touch me, ever. Or just even in general, I don't like being touched by a lot of people. But the whole thing of, like, everyone at the start of it was like, oh, 6 feet, sorry. Like, you could literally turn to somebody, and I have before, who was just getting too close to you in a line and say, hey man, leave some room for Jesus, and they back right off and like, oh, sorry. But
yeah,
speak on all of these as labels. As it turns out, like we were talking about how these generations, most of them are more or less used as a marketing gimmick. A lot of ad agencies are really interested in all of these groups, depending on what kind of products you can sell to them, and that seems to be a lot of the driving force. They weren't originally created by them, but they're more or less pushed on everyone because of a lot of those corporations.
And that's just generational labels, not even talking about any other types of labels that exist in the world.
When it comes to a lot of more recent generations like millennials, Gen Z, or even Gen Alpha, which, as young as they are, we don't know where a lot of their leanings on certain issues might be. But in the millennials and Gen Z, there does seem to be more of a degree of polarization, in the sense, especially politically, a lot of them will be either a lot more right-wing leaning or a lot more left-leaning. Like, it's almost a meme at this point of, you see a 30-year-old on Twitter, they're either posting a lot of like hard right stuff, or you see most of them just posting a lot of communist stuff or anything like that. A lot of activism does seem to be a lot more common among our generations, in that we tend to wear like our personal politics on our sleeves, compared to some of the previous generations, which would sort of just like keep it silent until it was relevant. Like around election season, you'd either get that one weird uncle who has opinions, or you'd have that family member who's just talking about like, hey, you should do this because this. Whereas,
I mean, it does make sense for that to happen, as well. I know from my own personal experience growing up, it makes sense that we were a pretty vocal group, because I'm not saying that, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that my generation was harder or had it rougher or anything like that. I'm just stating what I do know about when I was growing up. It seemed like there was a lot of things that were coming to light about families and people in general started up then. It's more so now because of cancel culture and stuff like that. But back then, it was it wasn't new, but it was relatively new, because, like he said, the previous generations tended to keep a little bit more quieter about things, about their problems. But over time, when it got to like when I was growing up, things were coming to light. People were starting to understand more about things like child abuse or spousal abuse. It was becoming more common to actually find that those happy little families weren't so happy. Divorce rates were much higher, or starting to be much higher during that time. And as someone who did have her parents divorce, my parents divorced when I was about 4.5. They got separated when I was about 4.5. I should say that they didn't officially divorce until I was about 5 or 6, going on 6 years old. But that's a whole story in and of itself. But anyway, and as someone who did grow up living in what, at the time, as a kid, of course, I didn't understand it, but growing up as an adult now, I do understand that what I grew up in, at least on one side of things, was an abusive household, a mentally, emotionally, and sometimes physically, depending on some things, abusive household. So, of course, my generation is going to be more vocal, because when we were growing up, people were starting to show us what things meant and what things really were, to an extent. I know I'm being very vague, because I don't really want to go into that whole discussion. Maybe a different episode I might, but essentially our generation being more vocal about stuff was literally because we were being shown, and especially for me, like with the person my dad is, like with him being someone who tried his best to encourage me to fight back, because his generation and the generation before his didn't fight back. His started to fight back on certain things, but it was my generation that really started to get into the fighting back mentality. There's a lot of my generation that were still quiet and scared and shy to fight back, just like the generations previously, because that's how we were raised. But thankfully, I had a parent that he definitely encouraged me to ask why. He definitely encouraged me to fight back on certain things, to always question things if I didn't understand. Always look for the answers, for the truth. Never stop learning and never stop fighting for yourself. So I can understand why my generation would be seen as a more vocally inclined one. Because there were so many parents at the time that were like my dad out there, so many adults, so many mentors and advisors who, like my dad, advised people like me growing up to fight back against the system, because the system is wrong.
Yeah.
The system at the time especially was wrong about a lot of things.
Mm-hmm. And even a lot of the changes that we've seen over the years is because a lot of stuff has been coming more into the forefront, like specifically on LGBTQ rights and stuff like that. It was around Gen Z was born around the time that they grew up around when gay marriage was even legal. Generation Alpha, they're being born after that, where it's been taken not quite as a given, because there has been a lot of push from the right to try and eliminate a lot of those rights, and a lot of things under that sort of almost progressive umbrella, like a lot of women's liberation stuff that's become almost canon has been overturned, like specifically with abortion and Roe v. Wade, where everything's now being left up to the states to decide as opposed to leaving it for the government, the federal government anyway. Because something like that, and this is one argument I've always had against a lot of the politics, is where, we're living in one country, even though we're 50 separate states all coming together. I shouldn't have to worry about going to a different state and not having the same laws as I have in my home state. To me, that's just absolutely asinine. Because if it's supposed to be a union, then why the hell is it illegal in Texas for me to buy a 6th dildo, whereas in Wisconsin, I'm perfectly fine owning as many rubber dicks as I want? That's not even a joke.
Maybe that's another episode for you to do entirely on, is literally the ridiculous laws between states.
Mm-hmm. And, at this point, there's a lot more that I want to go into with labels, like how we introduced this, but that might be an episode in and of itself, because we're already going pretty long right now.
So explaining what the different generational labels are, before we cut off, I would at least like to mention that while we have discussed, or especially him, he has given what each of those labels represent, the ages or generations that are in those little boxes of those generational labels. That is only one type of label in of itself that is out there and used today in social media, especially as a way to is a new tool to stereotype.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's one of the things that I wanted to get into with this episode, is that while a lot of these labels are nice and convenient for anyone who's a millennial, if you know somebody else who is also a millennial, you have a pretty good idea of the kind of stuff they might be into because you grew up around the same time. It's not 100% because, go figure, monolithically painting an entire group of people under one banner isn't necessarily a good thing. A lot of it does serve more or less to divide us, because one thing that a lot of social media encourages is the whole sort of anti-boomer mentality that's been going on. A few years ago, it was sort of a meme to just say, okay, boomer, anytime you had an older person or perceived older person who's got a sort of regressive or bad take on something. That may just come from how they were raised up. That may be based on their personal views. But if you're immediately just throwing them out of the picture because of that, then there's no chance for any kind of dialogue. By immediately dismissing that person, you've immediately closed off the door for any sort of growth or change or understanding between the two groups.
And in saying that, even though this podcast isn't, as I've said before, and as he added to, isn't a safe space sort of thing, because we know how safe spaces tend to be considered. What this podcast is a area for exactly that. Instead of cutting off that form of communication, there is communication here, even if we do not always see eye to eye on some things. And I know me and him don't always see eye to eye on things, just like in the first episode. It may have been seeming very contradictory the way we talked, but that was just it. It was the discussion between our opinions of the same topic. We are not pushing a point. We are not pushing a point of view. We are not trying to tell you how to think or to feel or to change your mind about how you perceive a subject. Your opinion, your perception, your point of view is yours. This is just a way for us to discuss our point of views and our opinions, even if they differ, without having a objective to change one of the others. Instead, this is a place for that communication that had been cut in social media, and a place where we can honestly say that, yeah, okay, you don't agree with what I say, but I'm not going to sit here and go, I agree, let's just agree to disagree, because in that, saying that in of itself can also be a way or means to cut off communication with somebody else, because you're not open to hearing them out. Instead, it should, in my opinion, at least in this podcast, I respect your views, and all I ask is a little bit of respect for mine. If you don't wish to respect mine because that is your viewpoint to take, okay. You don't have to respect my viewpoint, but I will respect yours.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too, is, like, as long as your viewpoints aren't something like you believe everybody of a certain race doesn't deserve to exist, or you believe that everybody of a, according to you, deviant sexuality or personal identity doesn't deserve to exist, then yeah, I am absolutely against your opinions and everything that you stand for. Because, yeah, that's not okay. And I would actively seek to encourage the discourse of, well, I don't want to use the discourse, but a dialogue of why you believe that, as opposed to just outright ousting you. But at the same time, there's also a point where you can easily tell where that's not going to be productive. That's where you get things like cancel culture, where it's gotten to a point to where any sort of dialogue or communication on it is untenable, because all it serves to do is further those kind of viewpoints, which, while I do not believe in creating this as an echo chamber of any sort, like, there are certain views that I will not allow on here.
Yeah, which is understandable.
Like,
but since we didn't get into everything about labels, and I apologize. Basically, I am apologizing that we didn't get through all the label stuff. I know we bounced around from, it seems like, non-connected topics, but to me they were connected, and that's where my brain went. And I'm a little bit scatterbrained today, if it hasn't been noted. I honestly do not know why I'm scatterbrained today, but I am. But if it pleaseth anyone to hear a continuation of the labels talk, then we may, or you may be inclined to encourage Misfit to maybe make a part 2, or make a whole series about labels. Who knows? And maybe we might elaborate a little bit more on why the name Kinda Fruity, or even what it means to be a pansexual, demisexual, or a demisexual bigender person. who knows? And if there are topics that you want to hear discussed, feel free to let him know. Because even though I'm a part of this, Misfit is the owner of this podcast. He is the overseer of this. And therefore, I would very much like it if people would go to him and mention topics. While, sure, fine, you want to comment to me or say something to me, go for it. I don't mind, but I just know that he'll most likely be informed of that, and if nothing happens and you don't get the episode that you want or the discussion you want, it's literally because, not because I didn't say anything, but because a person did not go directly to Misfit to get that handled. And we may have guests if we can talk some friends into joining on certain topics. Who knows? But that's all I have to say right now.
I think that's a good spot for us to end it on. So, thank you everybody once again for listening, and if you liked it, please give us a rating on your podcast app of choice. Quick notes, like, unfortunately, yeah, there's going to be some audio issues here and there, because we're still starting this out, so we may not have the best equipment, but if you liked our content, be sure to give us a 5-star or a equivalent of that on whatever app you're on. Like, by this point, well, everybody knows that it's almost the same as in any sort of service industry. If it's not 5 stars, it's a 0. So, if you want to see more of our stuff recommended in your feed, give us those sweet upvotes, or leave a comment. You can find us always on Podbean, Spotify, or even on iHeartRadio. So, once again, thank you everybody for watching or listening, and have a great rest of your day.
And if this finds you at night, and you're listening in the deep dark, then good night. Sleep tight. Don't let the big buds bite.
Have a good one.